Odessa Lanier set her wineglass down so carefully that it barely made a sound against the linen tablecloth, but inside her chest, something had just cracked wide open. Across the table, Desmond's mother had said something in rapid Korean, her eyes flicking toward Odessa for half a second before sliding away, and the entire table erupted in laughter. Not warm laughter, not the kind that invites you in, the kind that closes a door softly in your face while smiling the whole time. Odessa kept her expression still. She had built a 9-figure hospitality empire out of rooms just like this one, rooms where people underestimated her, rooms where power moved in silence and in glances, rooms where the loudest voice in the room was rarely the most dangerous. She knew how to sit in discomfort without flinching. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was Desmond's family home in the hills above a quiet Georgia suburb, and the people laughing at whatever had just been said were people she had hoped, for his sake, would one day call her family too. Before we go further, if you love stories about grace under pressure, about love that gets tested and comes out stronger, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe if you're new here, because this story is about to take a turn nobody at that table saw coming. Desmond reached under the table and found her hand, giving it a small squeeze, an apology without words. He leaned toward her and whispered, "I'm sorry. My mother, she's not used to this yet. Just give her time." Odessa gave him a small nod, but her mind had already drifted backward, retracing the steps that had brought her to this exact chair, at this exact table, surrounded by people speaking a language they assumed she couldn't understand. She had met Desmond Pruitt 18 months earlier at a hospitality conference in Busan, South Korea, where she had been scouting locations for her newest luxury resort brand, Soleil Coastal Hotels. Desmond, an architect who specialized in sustainable coastal design, had been hired as a local consultant for a competing firm, but fate, or maybe just bad weather, had stranded them both at the same rain-soaked ferry terminal on Jeju Island for 6 hours. What started as shared frustration over a canceled boat turned into shared coffee, then shared dinner, then long phone calls across 12 time zones that neither of them wanted to end. Odessa had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night and dreamed out loud about her daughter owning one someday. Odessa had made that dream literal. By the time she was 34, she owned 11 boutique hotels across 3 continents, and Forbes had her face on a list that made grown men in expensive suits suddenly very interested in shaking her hand. But money had never bought her the one thing she actually wanted, which was somewhere to belong that didn't come with a price tag attached. Desmond had felt different from the start. He didn't ask about her net worth, he asked about her mother's hands, rough from years of scrubbing floors, and whether Odessa still called her every Sunday. He noticed the small things, and when he finally brought her home to meet his family, she had been nervous in a way that no billion-dollar deal had ever made her, because deals could be renegotiated, but families either opened their arms or they didn't. Tonight, it was becoming painfully clear which one this was going to be. The dinner had started warmly enough. Desmond's father, a retired engineer named Park Suk-won, had greeted her with a firm handshake and a genuine smile, complimenting the bottle of wine she'd brought. His younger sister, Ji-in, a graduate student studying abroad, had been friendly, asking Odessa about her travels with real curiosity. But Desmond's mother, Min-hee, had barely looked at her since she walked through the door, and the family matriarch, Desmond's grandmother, Yoon-ja, had said almost nothing at all, simply watching Odessa with sharp, unreadable eyes from the head of the table. It was around the second course, a delicate seafood pancake that Odessa complimented sincerely, that Min-hee had turned to her husband and begun speaking in fast, clipped Korean. Odessa caught a few isolated words. She had picked up scattered phrases during her time on Jeju, but not enough to follow the full sentence. What she did catch unmistakably was Desmond's name, followed by a tone that needed no translation at all. Disapproval has a universal accent. "Mom," said Desmond quietly, switching back to English, his jaw tightening. "English, please." Min-hee waved a hand as if swatting away a fly. "It's a family dinner, Desmond. We can speak how we like in our own home." "She's a guest," said Desmond, his voice rising slightly. "She's your girlfriend," Min-hee corrected, not looking at Odessa. "There's a difference." The table went quiet. Ji-yoon looked down at her plate. Suk-won cleared his throat and reached for more rice, the universal gesture of a man trying very hard not to be dragged into a war he didn't start. And Yoonja, the grandmother, simply watched, her spoon resting untouched beside her bowl. Odessa felt heat rise in her chest, but she smiled instead, calm and unbothered on the surface, a skill she had spent years perfecting in rooms full of men who doubted a black woman could run a hotel, let alone 11 of them. "It's all right," she said gently, though it very much was not. "I understand family dinners have their own rhythm. I'm just happy to be here." Min-hee's eyes flicked to her for the first time, something unreadable passing behind them, before she turned back to her husband and continued speaking Korean, faster now, sharper, clearly annoyed that Odessa hadn't taken the bait to make a scene. Odessa caught the word donjon, which she vaguely remembered meaning something like gold digger, and something about hotel, and she understood with a slow-burning certainty that Min-hee assumed she was some struggling woman who had latched onto her son for financial security. The irony was almost funny. Almost. Desmond's hand tightened around his fork. "Mom, that's enough." "I'm simply talking to your father," Min-hee said sweetly, in English now, the picture of innocence. If you're already feeling that tension in your chest, imagine sitting at that table. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Odessa's shoes, because trust me, what happens next is going to surprise every single one of you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe now, because this story only gets better from here. The meal continued in uneven waves, moments of forced politeness, punctuated by sharp exchanges in Korean that Odessa mostly couldn't follow. She kept her composure, kept complimenting the food, kept asking Ji-yoon polite questions about her studies, kept doing everything a graceful guest should do. But inside, something old and familiar was stirring, a memory she hadn't let herself think about in years. Because Min-hee wasn't the first person to assume Odessa didn't belong in a room. She had grown up being underestimated her entire life, by teachers who assumed she wouldn't go to college, by investors who assumed a young black woman from a poor neighborhood in Charleston couldn't possibly understand hospitality economics, by men in negotiating rooms who directed every question to her assistant instead of her. Odessa had learned long ago that the loudest response to disrespect was rarely anger. It was quiet, devastating competence. And she had something up her sleeve that none of them, not even Desmond, fully knew about. 3 years before meeting Desmond, during the early days of scouting Jeju Island for her resort project, Odessa had lived for nearly 8 months in a small fishing village on the island's southern coast. She had rented a room from an elderly woman named Halmoni Kang, a retired haenyeo, one of the legendary female divers who harvested seafood from the ocean floor with nothing but a wetsuit and their own held breath. Halmoni Kang had taken a liking to the quiet American woman who asked so many questions and worked so hard, and in the long evenings after Odessa's site visits, the old woman had taught her the island's dialect, Jeju, a language so distinct from standard Korean that many linguists classified it as endangered and nearly extinct, understood fluently now by a shrinking handful of elderly islanders. Odessa had learned it not because she planned to use it, but because Halmoni Kang had been lonely, and teaching her granddaughter's dialect to someone who actually wanted to listen had brought light back into the old woman's eyes. Odessa had spent those months absorbing the rhythms, the strange vowels, the words that existed nowhere else on earth, partly out of respect, partly out of grief for her own grandmother back in Charleston who had passed before Odessa made her first million, before there was money enough to make anything easier. She had never told Desmond the full extent of it. It had felt like a private thing, a gift Halmoni Kang had given her that didn't need to be paraded around, until tonight. Because as the dinner wore on and Min Hee's comments grew sharper and Yoonja continued watching from the head of the table with those unreadable eyes, something extraordinary happened. Yoonja finally spoke, but not in standard Korean like the rest of the family. She spoke in a soft, rolling dialect, the vowels curling differently, the rhythm entirely unlike anything else at that table. She was speaking Jeju. "No mu mianhae," Yoonja murmured, so quietly that only Odessa, straining, caught the shape of it. "I'm so sorry," in a dialect that hadn't been spoken in that household in decades, not since Yoonja herself had left Jeju Island as a young bride 50 years ago and buried her native tongue somewhere beneath a lifetime of assimilation into mainland Korean life, into a world that had no use for the old Jeju Island words. Min Hee glanced at her mother-in-law, confused. "Amoni, what did you say?" Yoonja didn't answer. She was still looking at Odessa, and something in her old eyes had shifted, sharpened, softened, all at once. Odessa's heart pounded. She had two choices in that moment. She could stay quiet, keep the peace, let the secret remain hers, or she could speak. She set down her chopsticks. "Halmang," Odessa said, using the Jejuo word for grandmother instead of the standard Korean, halmoni, her voice steady despite the way her pulse was hammering in her throat. "Gomawo, kchianhayo." "Thank you. It's all right." The table fell into a silence so complete that Odessa could hear the ceiling fan spinning overhead. Min Hee's mouth actually fell open. Jian's fork clattered against her plate. Sukwon froze mid-chew, his eyes wide. Desmond turned to Odessa so fast his chair scraped against the floor, disbelief written across every line of his face. "You," Desmond started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Yoonja rose halfway from her seat, both hands pressed flat against the table, staring at Odessa as if she were seeing a ghost. "Odiso," she breathed, how do you know that language?" Odessa met the old woman's eyes and answered again in Jejuo, slower this time, giving the words room to land the way Halmoni Kang had taught her, with respect, with weight. "Jeju sarasoyo, yodol dari," she said. "I lived in Jeju, 8 months. Halmang Kang keso bewosoyo. I learned from grandmother Kang." The name landed like a thunderclap. Yoonja's hand flew to her chest. "Kang Halmang? Henyo? The diver?" Tears had already begun gathering in the corners of her eyes, and her voice cracked as she switched disbelievingly back and forth between the dialect and standard Korean, as if she couldn't decide which language could hold the shock rising inside her. "That's my mother's village. I left when I was 19. I married a mainland man, and his family told me the island language was shameful, backward, something to bury. I buried it so deep I thought I'd lost the key. 50 years, and I never once heard another living soul speak it back to me, not my children, not my grandchildren. I thought I would die with it locked inside me, and no one would ever know it existed except in my dreams." She reached across the table, her wrinkled hand trembling, and Odessa met it with her own, the gesture entirely unplanned, entirely instinctive. "Halmang Kang would be so proud," Odessa said gently, still in the dialect, her voice thick with emotion now too. She always said the language was a bridge, not a wall. She said if even one more person carried it, it wasn't gone yet. Yoonja let out a sound that was half sob, half laughter, and squeezed Odessa's hand so tightly it almost hurt. You carried it here, she whispered, across an entire ocean, into my son's dining room and gave it back to me. Min-hee had gone very pale, watching her own mother-in-law weep openly over a language she herself had never learned, never valued, never even known was slipping away in her own household for 50 silent years. Something in her expression cracked open, shame flooding in where arrogance had been sitting comfortably just minutes before. I didn't know, Min-hee said quietly, almost to herself. Then, looking up at Odessa, her voice smaller than it had been all evening, I'm sorry. I assumed things about you that weren't fair. I was cruel, and I did it thinking you wouldn't understand a word of it. I was wrong on every count. Odessa nodded slowly, choosing grace even now, even after everything. I understand being protective of your family, she said. I understand wanting the best for your son. I just wish we could have started somewhere kinder. We can start again, Min-hee said, and for the first time all evening, she reached for Odessa's water glass and refilled it herself, a small domestic gesture that, in that household, apparently meant something close to an apology. Seok-wan, finally finding his voice, let out a low whistle and shook his head with something between admiration and disbelief. In 40 years of marriage, I have never once heard my wife speechless. Tonight, you accomplished the impossible. Even Ji-yoon laughed through tears of her own, wiping her eyes with her napkin. I'm gonna need you to teach me at least 10 words before you leave tonight. This is the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed at a family dinner. Desmond, still staring at Odessa like he was seeing an entirely new dimension of the woman he loved, finally found words. 8 months on Jeju, and you never once mentioned learning an entire endangered dialect from a retired sea diver. What else haven't you told me? Odessa laughed, the tension of the evening finally breaking apart, like clouds after a storm. A woman has to keep a few surprises, Desmond. Otherwise, what's the fun in forever? The rest of the dinner unfolded entirely differently than it had begun. Yoonja insisted Odessa move to the seat directly beside her, and for the next hour, the two women spoke back and forth in the old island dialect, Yoonja teaching Odessa words she'd forgotten she still remembered, both of them laughing and crying in equal measure, while the rest of the family listened, some understanding fragments, most understanding none of the words, but all of the feelings behind them. Min-hee, humbled and clearly moved, spent the rest of the evening asking Odessa genuine questions about her company, her mother in Charleston, how she'd built Solene coastal hotels from a single renovated bed and breakfast into an international brand. When she learned, almost by accident, through an offhand comment from Desmond, that Odessa's personal net worth exceeded anything Min-hee had imagined, something like embarrassment flickered across her face, quickly replaced by something more valuable, respect that had nothing to do with money at all, because by then, the money was almost beside the point. What mattered was a woman who sat quietly through disrespect, chosen grace instead of retaliation, and then, without a single note of triumph or spite, handed an old grandmother back a piece of herself she thought she'd lost forever. Before we get to the ending, and trust me, it's a good one, let me remind you to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment about the moment that hit you hardest, because we've got so many more stories like this coming, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Later that night, after the dishes had been cleared, and Ji-yoon had extracted a promise from Odessa to teach her more Jeju-o phrases over video call, after Seok-wan had shaken Odessa's hand a second time with considerably more warmth than the first, after Min-hee had hugged her, awkwardly but sincerely, at the front door, Desmond walked Odessa to her car under a sky full of stars. I need you to know something. He leaned against the car door, his voice quiet in the cool night air. I've watched you walk into rooms full of men who doubted you and walk out having closed the deal anyway. I've seen you handle boardrooms and investors and reporters who ask you ridiculous questions about being a woman running a hotel empire. But I've never seen anything like what you did in there tonight. You didn't just win my mother over, you gave my grandmother back 50 years of herself. I didn't plan it, Odessa said softly. "I never wanted to use it as some kind of trump card. I just couldn't sit there and watch her cry alone, with no one to answer her." "That's exactly why it worked," Desmond said, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "You did it because it was true, and because you cared. That's the whole difference." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like a confirmation of something that had already been decided a long time ago, back on a rain-soaked ferry dock on an island neither of them had expected to change their lives. 3 months later, Yoonja stood at the front of a small, sunlit garden ceremony in Charleston, South Carolina, dressed in a beautiful hanbok in soft shades of blue, holding tightly to Odessa's mother's hand, as the two older women, from entirely different worlds, laughed together like old friends over something neither of their families quite understood, sharing memories of daughters and granddaughters they were both fiercely proud of. Min-hee sat in the front row beside Suk-won, dabbing at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, and Ji-yoon stood as one of Odessa's bridesmaids, having spent the last 3 months diligently practicing her grandmother's forgotten dialect, determined that it would never again disappear inside one silent generation. When Desmond and Odessa exchanged their vows, Yoonja insisted on speaking a small blessing over the couple, and she spoke it in Jejuo, her voice steady and clear and unashamed for the first time in 50 years, no longer a secret buried out of shame, but a gift spoken proudly in front of everyone she loved. Odessa answered her back in the same dialect, and though most of the guests had no idea what either woman had said, everyone understood, watching the tears streaming freely down Yoonja's face, that something profound and healing had passed between them. Odessa Lanier had walked into that family as an outsider, deliberately excluded, quietly underestimated, spoken about instead of spoken to. She left it, months later, not just as Desmond's wife, but as the woman who had reached across an ocean of silence and handed an old grandmother her own forgotten voice, proving that the deepest kind of belonging isn't given, it's built, word by word, language by language, one act of grace at a time. And if this story moved you even half as much as it moved everyone sitting at that table, don't just scroll past it. Like this video, leave a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe right now, because there are so many more stories just like Odessa's waiting for you. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.